Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. I want to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe. Join our growing international community. Now let's get right into our main story today, which is going to be concerning Vladimir Putin, and more specifically, Putin's methodology, and his approach to negotiations and behavior on the international scene. Now, obviously, this report relates directly to the Russo-Ukrainian crisis, where tensions have been growing much higher, to the point where many people in the West who have previously been claiming that war is not going to happen are saying, holy shit, war is going to happen. In addition to this, many people in Ukraine are genuinely beginning to feel that war could be imminent. Now, that is a major change in the last 2 days since we last reported on the Russo-Ukrainian crisis. Now, just to give a quick update of what has developed in the last 2 days. But before that, just a quick refresher on why this entire conundrum is occurring. Now, we're not going to go into detail. If you are so curious, go into our Euro playlist. You will see an extensive amount of videos made on the Ukrainian crisis, most of which are split into different segments about specific areas of what's going on, either economically, politically, or what other actors' motivations are. Now, at the very heart of the crisis is a standoff between Russia and the West, more specifically NATO and the United States. Now, Russia has amassed more than 100,000, it's believed around 130,000 soldiers around Ukraine's border, more specifically to the north and the east. Russia has the military capabilities to launch a multi-front invasion on Ukraine. More specifically, from Belarus, they are able to enter the capital of Kyiv, which is only 40 miles, 45 miles, or 70 kilometers for our non-American friends away from the border of Belarus. Now, Russia has stationed these soldiers, and they have begun to conduct war games with their CSTO partner country, Belarus, led by President Alexander Lukashenko. These war games have been increasing in intensity, scope, and size, and it has been a demonstration of force, one that has been genuinely actually scaring people. War games are something that is considered normal, provocative but normal, and everyone expects them in these kinds of situations. And everyone knew this was happening. Russia did inform the international community that war games would be occurring with Belarus from February 10th to February 20th. But the scale, size, and just the simple demonstration of power that Russia has been able to carry out with these war games are something that we have not seen since the Cold War, and have actually effectively terrified people, which is the whole purpose of war games. So they have actually been successful, and it's only been about 2 days now. Now, the reality is Russia has stated that it will remove these soldiers from the Russian-Ukrainian border and the Belarusian-Ukrainian border if the North Atlantic Treaty Organization meets two demands of NATO. Number one is that Ukraine be permanently banned from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Number two is that the United States and its NATO allies remove all military assets, including soldiers and weapons, from nations in Eastern Europe and former Soviet republics that are close to Russia. Now, NATO has stated that's not going to fucking happen. We're not going to block any country from entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and there is a good reason for that. NATO is a free-to-join international organization that is based on the principle of self-determination. Its doors are always open. So NATO cannot set a precedent for any nation and say you're not allowed to join permanently. That would have long-term consequences for the stability and the solidarity of NATO. So NATO is not going to meet those demands. Two, it's not going to remove its soldiers and its military assets surrounding Ukraine and close to Russia simply because it has the right to. NATO is not going to bow to external pressure to remove its military assets from its military allies. That is the entire purpose of a military alliance. So there is a stalemate that is virtually impossible to resolve. NATO and the United States have stated that is not going to happen. They are non-starters, meaning they're non-negotiable. Vladimir Putin has stated that he is not going to take no for an answer. So we have reached a stalemate. Now, this stalemate has existed for about the last 2 weeks. The United States sent a formal response to Vladimir Putin after he made formal demands of the two demands that we just mentioned. Vladimir Putin has not provided a formal response yet, and it's been 2 weeks. That's a long time Just make a written response. You've said in public, Vladimir, how you feel about this. Just write it down on paper and send it in the mail. You have people that do this for you. Now, obviously, I'm joking. Vladimir Putin is doing this to buy time and to increase tensions in what is known as brinkmanship. Now, brinkmanship is something we cover frequently on this show, not just related to Ukraine. Brinkmanship is a concept that emerged during the Cold War period, and Henry Kissinger really wrote about it extensively. Now, what brinkmanship is when there are tensions or a disagreement in securing national interest between two countries or two international entities that results in conflict. Brinkmanship is one or both parties, they can do it at the same time, but it's typically a unilateral action. So it's always unilateral, is taken by one party to intentionally cause provocations, intentionally build up tensions, and intentionally make it look like war is going to happen any day. Now, the purpose of this is not to go to war, and it's not to provoke the other party to attack you first so you have an excuse to defend yourself. The purpose of brinkmanship is to completely avoid war. However, by making it seem like war is going to happen and building tensions up to a breaking point, it makes it much more likely that the other side, in this case, the West, the NATO pact, and the United States, are going to make more concessions for Russia that are more favorable. The more Vladimir Putin scares Ukraine, the United States, and its allies into believing that war is going to happen, which, again, no one wants, the more likely it is that during negotiations to create preemptive peace, Vladimir Putin is going to receive much more favorable concessions for Mother Russia. Now, some have stated that Vladimir Putin is pushing this too damn far. And the reality is he's not. This is normal brinkmanship, and it's something that's completely to be expected. Now, some people have said that Vladimir Putin is gambling and taking major risks and that he's provoking the West into going to war. But the reality is no one in this entire situation wants to go to war. War would be devastating in terms of human life and infrastructural loss for Ukraine. Ukraine would be destroyed in the event that it went to war with Russia. In terms of the West, which would have negative economic consequences, especially Europe, who would not be able to import energy resources from Russia in the event of Western-backed sanctions against Russia if it invaded Ukraine. This would be economically crippling for Europe, specifically in the energy sector, which has been draining the pockets of consumers and voters. And finally, it would be absolutely damaging and destructive to Russia, not just in the amount of human life they would lose by going to war with Ukraine, but also in the fact that it would really negatively impact the Russian economy. The United States and its Western allies have began to become more unified in the proposed sanctions that they have situated and prepared for Russia in the event it invades Ukraine. Some things that are on the table are blocking Russia from the United States dollar. It is also possible that that can be done with the euro, which would really hurt Russia as it would completely block it off from most international and foreign trade. Two is shutting down a lot of Russia's pipelines. The easiest one to shut down is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is completed but has yet to begin processing and sending natural gas from Russia to Germany. This would affect Russia negatively because its major source of income is selling fuel and energy resources to foreign countries. Now, Vladimir Putin, as many have accused him of, seems to be gambling and taking a huge risk. Now, I don't want to go that far. I think it's absolutely undeniable when you look at the history of Vladimir Putin and the way that he behaves on the international scene. He has a very high tolerance for risk, and he is willing to push things and test limits to the max. But Vladimir Putin is not someone that gambles. Vladimir Putin is someone that sits down and takes cold, calculated risks, and in most cases, not all, but in most cases, they do fundamentally pay off. Now, I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen in this case. Again, we are in a situation where neither the West nor Russia want to meet on either of the demands. But these war games will eventually end. However, while there have been a lot of diplomatic efforts going on from France, from Russia, from Germany, from the United States, from Ukraine, from pretty much everyone involved, some of these have actually begun to become aggressive. Now, most recently, yesterday, British Foreign Secretary, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Britain, visited Russia and had a meeting with her Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. Now, the British Foreign Minister, Liz Truss, I believe her name is, began to kind of lecture and just talk too much towards Sergei Lavrov. And Lavrov not erupted, but openly said, I'm not going to sit here and listen to Western lectures, and that Russia's not going to be mocked by the West. And later, during a press conference for the public press, Lavrov was visibly mocking Liz Truss. Now, this has increased tensions a lot. This was a huge diplomatic failure on the end of Britain, and specifically on Foreign Minister Liz Truss, who, in my opinion, should give a resignation. Now, this was not something that was necessary, but it's not something that we can't come back from. There have been some proposals of what could potentially be a compromise that saves face. And what I mean by save face, it means that both parties get to relatively secure their interest, but more importantly, don't embarrass themselves in front of the international community or their own people. Basically, what needs to be found here is a solution that looks like both sides won, while both sides also lost. Russia needs a solution that makes it look like it won while the West lost, while the West needs a solution that looks like it won while Russia lost. Now, there have been some proposals. Number one has been for NATO to create a complete moratorium, just a brief pause on accepting any NATO member states. Now, the reality is this proposal is actually complete bullshit, and it doesn't actually make anyone happy, and it just makes the situation worse. Number one, because it would be embarrassing for NATO to create a moratorium on any potential state, not just Ukraine, but every state. So if a country in Africa wanted to join NATO, for example, it wouldn't be able to, because NATO would create a moratorium the last 5 to 10 years on preventing other states from joining. Number two, this does not meet Russia's demands. If it's just a temporary moratorium, Ukraine can join NATO 10, 20, 30 years down the road, and it's just going to cause more long-term problems. And finally, it needs to be stated that the United States and the West have no interest on Ukraine joining NATO. Zero. The door is always open to Ukraine, but Ukraine has not received a formal invitation, and it's not going to. Ukraine is economically behind many Western countries to meet the standard of joining NATO. In addition to this, Ukraine has a very, very, very high level of corruption. As charming as their president, Volodymyr Zelensky, may be, he's funny, he used to be a comedian and an actor, and in some weird, cute way, he's kind of attractive, I guess. Not really, in my opinion, but a lot of people think so. And he seems like this nice, scruffy outsider underdog that is just there for the people. But the reality is, don't let appearances fool you. Volodymyr Zelensky has been accused and proven in many different international papers of hiding his money, avoiding taxes, and being a lot wealthier than he has any business being as the president of Ukraine. So Ukraine has a high level of corruption, a lack of economic development, and two, Ukraine is currently occupied by their own standards. The annexation of Crimea is still going on and controlled by Russia. In addition to this, the eastern Donbass region is virtually controlled by Russian separatists who are shooting off shots. It's not a complete all-out war, because following the 2015 peace agreement in Minsk, things have calmed down, but there is still an exchange of fire occasionally between the pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian forces. Ukraine is a country that is occupied, essentially, in two different areas. It cannot join NATO, because if Ukraine joined NATO, it can just say, we go take back our land now. Very good. And what happens is, every single member state of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization legally is obliged to intervene and assist Ukraine. And no one wants this. Ukraine is too problematic, and it's carrying too much baggage. So Ukraine joining NATO really is not an option, period. So this first proposal of a long-term or even a short-term moratorium on potential member states joining NATO is not something that would satisfy either side. The other option that has been proposed is the Finlandization of Ukraine. Now, Finlandization is a complicated term. It is generally a pejorative term used to insult or degrade a country. What Finlandization means, it obviously takes its name from the country of Finland. Now, the name comes from how Finland behaved during the post-World War II Cold War period. Now, Finland was not a member of the Warsaw Pact, despite being past the Berlin Wall in Europe. Finland was neutral during the Cold War, maintaining decent relationships with the United States and with Russia at the same time. Now, what Finland allowed was that Russia essentially was able to act any way it wanted to in its foreign policy actions, and Finland would not speak up, not say anything, and not do anything about it. In addition to this, Finland's foreign policy actions were essentially dictated and determined by Russia. Basically, Finland had some level of nominal sovereignty and independence. However, as far as foreign policy and its behavior on the international scene were concerned, they were completely controlled by Russia. Now, a lot of people have said Finlandization is actually not a bad solution to this problem. But it is an insulting term. It was originally used by politicians in Western Germany during the Cold War to insult Finland and to state, if we allow the Russians to keep coming and influence the communist states and make us communist, invest in Germany and Europe, we will be Finlandized. So the Germans were afraid and using it as an example of what happens when you're a neighbor with Russia. So it's an insulting term. And because of this, and because of the fact that it takes away a nation's sovereignty in foreign policy, no Ukrainians would accept this, at least in the beginning. They would be completely opposed to such an idea because it would be Ukraine submitting itself to Russia. But it would prevent Ukraine from permanently joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization without NATO having to say we're stopping them from joining. The door is still open, but it's on Ukraine's end, and Ukraine's never going to want to join because its foreign policy will be determined by Russia. This is actually a perfect solution for the West and Russia. The West gets to save face and secure and consolidate its geopolitical sphere of influence outside of Ukraine, while Russia gets to secure its geopolitical sphere of influence inside Ukraine. It's actually a perfect settlement of the issue. However, most Ukrainian people would not agree to this. They would view this as, again, as I said, Ukraine bowing down to Russia. However, with enough efforts in the media to convince the people of Ukraine, it could eventually be viewed by the public of Ukraine as a better alternative than going to a completely destructive war, which Ukraine has no chance of winning, against Russia. Now, again, while that solution would be the easiest, it is not, I personally don't support making decisions that affect the national sovereignty, especially of the people of Ukraine. They're good people. They're hardworking people. They just want a better life. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and a chance to actually have a productive country. The final solution that's kind of viewed as an all sides kind of win, a little bit favorable to Russia, but one that is a solution and a compromise for everyone, is one that already exists: the 2015 Minsk Agreement. Now, the 2015 Minsk Agreement was a peace talk between Russia and Ukraine, brokered by France and Germany, to end the separatist movement in the eastern Donbass region, which, as we've covered multiple times and as I've stated in this episode, is essentially a civil war going on, being carried out by pro-Russian separatists who want their own independent region of Ukraine that are backed by Russia and are primarily Russian-speaking. Now, during the Minsk Agreement of 2015, Ukraine actually agreed to give the eastern Donbass region, controlled by these separatists, full autonomy. It would still be a part of Ukraine, but it would be an autonomous region that would have the right to make its own political decisions. In addition to this, they would grant amnesty to all the rebels that participated in the civil war or the uprising against Ukraine. Now, Ukraine would lose its Donbass region completely. Not literally, it would still be a part of Ukraine. And Donbass is important. It is the industrial heart of Ukraine. It's extremely economically important for the production and development of the country. Now, if it agreed to this, it would be losing the Donbass region. And many Ukrainians have felt that if they actually carried out the Minsk Agreement, that it would negatively affect and be a betrayal of Ukraine's national interest and its history and the people. But the reality is Ukraine doesn't control Donbass right now. They're not getting any economic productivity from that region. Nothing good is coming from Donbass. And Ukraine already agreed to the Minsk Agreement in 2015. They signed. They said, we'll do this. And then later they said, no, this betrayal of international interest. We're not going to do this. Which you don't do in international relations. When you make an agreement or an international treaty, you fucking follow through on it. Unless you're a superpower, then you can do whatever you want. But when you are a middle power or a smaller nation, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. And if Ukraine actually were to follow through on the Minsk Agreement and just say that we're going to give autonomy to Donbass and give them political asylum, the rebels that fought against Ukraine, and also recognize Crimea, eventually, this could be a solution that prevents Ukraine from joining NATO. And the reality is no one in NATO wants Ukraine to join. Only Ukrainians want to join NATO, but they're not welcome. That's just a harsh truth. I don't mean to offend anyone, but that's a harsh truth. Ukraine is too problematic to be in NATO. This would prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. However, it would allow for Ukraine's independence from Russia. Yes, it would lose 2 major regions to Russia, but Ukraine has many other regions, and it would just create a balance of Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, and would probably even eventually lead to better relations with Russia. And finally, the West would get to consolidate its interests by telling Ukraine, hey, you can join NATO, etc. one day, and they'll continue being a relatively decent partner in the region. This is a solution that can meet all sides. And French President Emmanuel Macron, who has toured Russia and Ukraine recently, has stated this, and that is on the table. Now, what solution is going to be implemented, we're going to see. But the purpose of this report was just to state that Vladimir Putin and the actions of Russia are to increase tensions until a compromise can be made. And finally, to state that options for a compromise exist. Wow, it may seem right now that war is inevitable. It's not. And it will probably be avoided. This is just another historical example of brinkmanship. Thanks for tuning in. This is what I think. If you disagree with me, let me know what you think. Comment. Let me know what you think of the Minsk agreement. Let me know what you think of Vladimir Putin. Let me know what you think about how this situation is going to turn out and what you think is the best resolution for everything. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.